Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And this is a topic that has been on my list since I worked on paper patterns, because this person is deeply connected to the Demarists, who we talked about at length during that, as kind of the a primary forerunner of paper patterns being widely available in multiple sizes in the U.S. So Jane Cunningham Croly, who wrote under the pen name Jennie June, was a journalist who advocated for equality for women. She wrote, as we'll talk about later, for the Demarists magazine. She is most well known, though, for founding one of the earliest clubs for women in the U.S. and kind of starting the women's clubs movement.
Jane Cunningham was born on December 19th, 1829, in Market Harborough, Leicestershire, England. Her parents, Joseph Howes and Jane Scott Cunningham, had 3 children already before Jane was born. She was smart, described as buoyant and magnetic. Her teachers loved her, and she and her father were very close from the beginning. According to an account written by her brother, the two of them remained close for the rest of their father's life.
When Jane was about 12 in 1841, the family moved from England to the U.S., eventually settling in New York State. And this move seems to have been precipitated by religious persecution. Joseph Cunningham was a Unitarian minister when England was not particularly friendly to that denomination of Christianity. There are some accounts that say that the family home was stoned at one point, which led Joseph and Jane to decide to move for the sake of the family's safety. Once they had gotten to the U.S., they lived briefly in Poughkeepsie before making their way to Wappingers Falls, a little to the south. That's still about 75 miles north of New York City. And their father, Joseph, built a home and filled the land around it with a massive and very productive garden. He typically grew more food than the family could use, and all of the extra went to neighbors or people in need.
According to some newspaper accounts, Jennie was a temperance enthusiast and a club starter from a very young age. One account, which was written shortly after her death and appeared in multiple papers, mentioned that at the age of 9, she founded a club called Band of Hope Temperance Society. Allegedly, this club had a song with the lyric, quote, "Shout aloud the inspiring lay, the band of hope must win the day." But that same account puts her at living in Massachusetts at the age of 9, which would have put the family in the United States earlier than her brother's writing, and all the other accounts say that they were. So this might not be the most trustworthy information.
No, but it's cute. The idea that she started a club. I have as a big writer of books and club starter myself as a kid, have a little kinship to that. As an adult, Jane moved in with her brother John, who at that point was working as a pastor in Worcester, Massachusetts. She took care of the house for him. She sometimes called his housekeeper. She also taught school, and she still found herself with enough spare time to start a small paper with a friend that was distributed twice a month to her brother's congregation. The two women wrote all of the contents of this newspaper, and they had readings of it in the church when it was released every 2 weeks. And those readings were reportedly very well attended.
In 1855, after their father died, Jane moved to New York City with the goal of pursuing a career as a writer. Her first article was accepted by the New York Tribune, and soon she pitched a regular column to the New York Sunday Times and Noah's Weekly Messenger. That started a career that would see great success. She started writing under the pen name of Jennie June, and in a lecture given to a women's society she later founded, she gave her own account of how that name began. Quote, "I was a sunny, happy little blue-eyed girl, and our genial Unitarian pastor was particularly fond of me. One day he gave me a little book of poems published by Benjamin F. Taylor, remarking, 'These are for the juniest little girl that I know.' One of the poems was called January and another Jennie June. For a long time, I was known to my intimates as Jennie June. The name almost passed out of my mind as I grew older till I commenced contributing to the papers, and then I bethought me of Jennie June as a nom de plume." A note on the spelling. Sometimes Jennie ends with a Y and sometimes with an IE. There's not really a solid indicator of which one she preferred. Her professional bylines ended with the IE, but in her own writing and the writing of her family, it changed back and forth. When it came to correspondence, she just used her initials.
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know if she cared especially. But Jennie June wrote what sounded like unimportant fodder for ladies. Her regular column for the Sunday Times was titled Parlor and Sidewalk Gossip. But she was, even in her early career, advocating for equality for women in some ways. We'll talk about the problems in a bit. And even in her career, just making that column, she was kind of trailblazing because she's often credited with being the first woman to syndicate a column. Parlor and Sidewalk Gossip, which often talked about, the popular clothes of the day, who was having a ball, who attended that ball, etc., ran in papers throughout the country in New York, Louisiana, Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky. In 1864, her columns were collected into a book titled Talks on Women's Topics. There was also a follow-up book written in 1869, also collecting the columns that had happened since that first book was published, called Jennie Juniana, Talks on Women's Topics.
Through her journalism work, Jane met another journalist named David G. Croly. Croly was originally from Ireland and had become a well-respected editor. They fell in love and got married on February 14th, 1856, when she was 26. Croly worked for the New York Herald as a reporter, and Jane and David lived in Manhattan together. According to Jane's brother John, David, quote, was a conservative Democrat of the strictest sort, a radical in religion, and had but little appreciation of the deeper forces at work in society and in national life. But he was able and honest and enjoyed the respect of his fellow craftsmen. Jane and David had 5 children together, 4 of whom lived to adulthood, then a son who died in infancy, Herbert, Viola, and Alice. One thing that was unique about the Croly marriage was that David did not expect Jane to stop working once they got married or after they had children. At a time when most women stopped being professionals the moment they became wives, Jane and David modeled a much more modern relationship in which Jane's professional work was supported and cheered on by her spouse. David is often mentioned in accounts and letters written by friends and family as frequently telling people how amazing he thought Jane was. To be clear, he does not seem to have been so progressive as to split the domestic duties with his wife, so Jane was taking care of the entire family and her career, and she often gave up sleep to make all that work.
Coming up, we're going to talk more about Jane's work and a brief move that the couple made to Illinois. But first, we will take a sponsor break. The same year that she became Mrs. Croly, Jane also started her first women's club called the Women's Parliament. This, of course, would be the first of many. But the Women's Parliament was intended to bring women together so they could talk about the role of women in society and how that role could change for the better. But this effort never really took off, so it's not often cited as an early women's club.
In 1859, the Crolys left New York for Rockford, Illinois. David had been chosen to be the new editor of the Rockford Register. This was not just a random thing that happened. The job came about because of family connections. The Register was financially backed by William Gore King, who was married to Jane's sister Mary. Some accounts state that this was an entirely new newspaper that David was launching, and others say that he was brought on to try to save it. The Library of Congress has a record of a Rockford Register that started in 1855 with an uncertain end date, so it seems like the latter scenario might be the accurate one. But David and Jane both really missed New York, and this paper did not succeed. So after a year in Illinois, they moved back to Manhattan.
Yeah, during that year was when they had their first child, which she was born in Illinois. But then, upon returning to New York, David became the managing editor for the New York World. And this was the first in a string of managing editor positions in the city that he held with a number of different papers. Jane became the head of the women's department for the paper, and she also became the primary staff writer for Madame Demarest's Mirror of Fashions at this time, which we, of course, mentioned in our recent episode on paper patterns. And Jennie June remained a fixture in the pages of the Demarest magazine as the periodical transitioned to become Demarest's monthly magazine with a more frequent publish cycle. Somehow, despite her busy work schedule and managing an entire household with 4 kids, Jane and David also had a regular social gathering at their home every Sunday.
Jennie June wrote extensively about the injustices of society as they related to women's causes, but not all of her advice for women was actually great for women. For example, in 1866, she published a book titled Jennie June's American Cookery Book. And in that she states, quote, "Food for the well is better than physic for the sick. Bad cooking is a crime. It is the cause of dyspepsia and a host of other evils. A woman convicted of it ought to be arraigned for manslaughter." I had a little shudder after reading that.
You and me both. Don't read this book. It would make you irate.
Also, for all of her claims toward equality for women, she writes some pretty old school things about women's role in a marriage. She opens the line of thought by saying that the first decision that a couple must make is, quote, "whether they shall keep house or board." She finds that men want to choose to keep house, but young wives often want to board because they don't know how to cook. And then she writes, quote, "The final result is that they go to board in some highly genteel establishment where the prices are high in proportion to the gentility and lack of real comfort. And some fine morning, the young gentleman wakes up to the knowledge that he is tied to a wife who doubles his expenses but has added nothing to his happiness, or at any rate, nothing to the real value and usefulness of his life. This is a matrimonial swindle. Girls ought not to marry unless they are ready and willing to accept the position of head of a household and capable of making a home what it should be to husband and children." I don't love that.
No, that was a big yikes for me. I was like, girl, we got to have a talk, Jennie June.
Meanwhile, I'm like, boarding somewhere where someone else is handling all the cooking and cleaning.
Sounds great. Well, it's also funny because it kind of echoes to the ongoing arguments that have been happening throughout my entire life, where there will occasionally be news stories about whether or not you should be eating out at restaurants or not.
Oh, yeah.
And whether or not that's wasteful. That's kind of the modern version of this. So it cracks me up a little. Overdramatic and wildly incorrect takes aside, this book is overall pretty practical, even though sometimes it's outdated. And I don't mean in terms of social mores, but like ingredients and stuff are not things we would use today. But in the introduction, one of the notes that really struck me was that there were not at the time actually many cookbooks written by women. So there wasn't a lot of information on the practicalities of planning meals while also running a household. And this seeks to fill that gap. One of the genuinely great pieces of advice that Jennie June offers specifically for setting up a kitchen is that you should not buy a bunch of stuff to set up your kitchen right away because, quote, "it is easy to add more when experience has discovered to you precisely what you want." I need this lesson all day, every day, because I will buy everything up front and then be like, I don't use that bacon press. She also recommends buying the nicest kitchen implements that you can afford because they will last forever. There is also a thing that just cracked me up and today would not fly. There's a small section of the book titled Label Children, and it just reads, quote, "into the crowns of the hats or bonnets of little children, sew a square of writing paper stating age and residence. This will save them from any danger of being lost."
I was like, what if the hat gets lost?
I know. I have so many questions about the feasibility of this approach.
Yeah, I mean, I see no problem with, putting the label with the child's name and maybe some contact info in there, but I don't think it's a solution to the child being lost, just the hat.
Yeah.
Anyway, Jennie June notes that no book is perfect and that hers is no exception. Quote, "It is not claimed for the present volume by the author that it fully meets the necessities of the case or has satisfactorily accomplished its task, even within the modest limits assigned to it. It is one thing to think how something may be done, and another thing to do it. But it is claimed that the object of the work has been constantly kept in view, that it has been executed lovingly, with a strong appreciation of the benefit and pleasure to be derived from good cooking, from the intermingling of the finer with the grosser elements, with a pleasant remembrance of good times spent in the kitchen, and with an earnest wish to make these duties seem attractive to the conscientious young wives who would willingly perform their part if they but knew how."
So now we come to a pivotal moment. In 1869, Charles Dickens was scheduled to speak at the Press Club of New York. This included a private dinner at Delmonico's, and Jane, like many other people, wanted to attend. But there was a problem. A news write-up about the event read, quote, "Some ladies of literary proclivities asked for invitations and got themselves snubbed by the journalists who were on the committee of invitations." Apparently, Horace Greeley, who was running this event, actually wanted the women invited, but the committee refused to admit the women. There is a whole lot of copy in accounts and newspapers about how the snub actually has to do with the men wanting to be able to smoke cigars, which they would not be able to do if women were present. Jennie June wrote about the snub in her column, and then other papers featured responses to her, many of which were largely condescending.
When Jane wrote about this series of events in a book almost 20 years later, she indicated that at first she had been allowed an invitation after applying for one through her husband. But once she had, other women started doing the same thing, and that was when the trouble started. She noted in that account that there was a condition applied just a couple of days out from the event that if the women could find enough other women willing to pay the $15 fee for the event, they could still come. But that close to the dinner, it was going to be impossible to meet that requirement, and everybody knew it. So the women took it as an affront.
Yeah, the logic, and I'm using air quotes behind it, was like, oh, if just a few ladies come, they'll feel so out of place and it will be miserable. They need a whole group of women, and then they'll be more comfortable. But $15 was an expensive dinner at the time. That's an expensive ticket for people to scrounge up at last minute. So everybody kind of knew this was meant to be an exclusionary qualifier. Jane, who seems to have just generally not have been comfortable being angry about a problem without trying to solve it, decided to create her own women's-only group. And that is how the group Sorosis was born. At a meeting with several other women just a few days after that Dickens dinner, Jane told everyone that her goal was to, quote, "supply the want of unity and secular organization among women." The women that were there agreed that this was a wonderful idea, and they all started to brainstorm what exactly this could be. They didn't want the group to be too focused on any single interest and ideology, so even names that borrowed from literature, for example, were dismissed. In an effort to make the group, in Jane's own words, quote, "hospitable to women of different minds, degrees, and habits of work and thought." So some of the names that had been suggested included just Women's League, Sphinx, which I sort of love, the idea being that it was slightly mysterious. Columbia, which they dismissed because they said it was too pedestrian and hackneyed. And then Blue Stocking Club, which is a literary reference, which got vetoed for that reason. Jane looked through a lot of books and dictionaries in an effort to find the perfect name. And she later wrote that she found the word sorosis in a botanical dictionary. The word refers to a fleshy fruit that requires multiple flowers to develop. This is one of those things where when you read write-ups about the forming of this group, there are often explainers of what the name means and how it happened that are in no way reflective of what Jane herself wrote about how she found it. But Jane took this to be, quote, full of gracious meaning. And a day later, the first iteration of the group was organized with just 12 members. Poet Alice Carey was elected its first president, and their first order of business was to send out invitations to potential new members to a lunch to be held for them at Delmonico's. And the day of the luncheon, they went from 12 members to 50.
Before long, cirrhosis had chapters in major cities around the country, and soon smaller cities and towns had them as well. The goal was always to help women professionally and socially. That was the goal of all the chapters above all else. While leadership was often asked what they were doing for various causes, the response was that they helped their members individually. Occasionally, though, they did raise funds for charity, but they never adopted any one cause as a special focus.
We'll talk about this on behind the scenes, but there was a fascinating amount of news coverage of the founding of cirrhosis, and it's part of why it did spread so quickly, was that people knew a lot about it very fast. Some of those write-ups were not kind, but it still got the word out that it existed. And while many chapters of cirrhosis were popping up seemingly everywhere, something else happened. There were suddenly a lot of other women's clubs forming. Many of them sought a more focused mission or identity than the more generalized setup of cirrhosis, but so many of them were patterned on its structure and the way it worked almost exactly. And almost all of them were focused on some form of women's equality or betterment.
After we hear from the sponsors that keep Stuff You Missed in History class going, we will talk about how Jane became the sole breadwinner for the family, and also how her work with women's clubs continued to expand.
Though cirrhosis took on a life of its own and kept Jane quite busy, she continued to work as a writer, and she was very successful at it, which is good, because her husband left his work in 1877 to promote positivism and to found the New York Church of Humanity. As you may recall early in the episode, her brother John described David as being a radical in religion, and this is part of it. However, he was not able to actively participate in that endeavor for very long because he soon had a really serious downturn in his health and was eventually bedridden.
Throughout all of this, Jane kept writing and working on activist projects. She purchased a half interest in Godey's Ladies book and worked at trying to keep it afloat, but eventually that magazine folded. In 1886, she published Cirrhosis, Its Origin in History, in which she talked about the beginnings of the club in its first 20 years.
David died in 1889, and it seemed that after his passing, Jane really rededicated herself to her women's groups, perhaps as a way to just stay busy. The same year she was widowed, she started the New York Women's Press Club. The following year, recognizing how large the women's club movement had become, she founded the General Federation of Women's Clubs to serve as an umbrella organization that could assist with all sorts of support needs and connect groups to one another. She later wrote that it had grown out of a desire to have a 21st anniversary event for cirrhosis that would be a convention of clubs. And she also founded a new magazine called The Cycle, or sometimes The Women's Cycle, which tickles me a little, which was part of the Federation's offerings.
In 1891, she wrote a book called Thrown on Her Own Resources, or What Girls Can Do. This is written as a resource for a young woman who's newly in a position to provide for herself. Croly writes, quote, "This may or may not be a hardship. Whether it is or not depends wholly upon the amount and quality of your practical and mental resources. Active work is a necessity of a healthful life. Are you equipped for your part in the battle? Have you courage and energy to carry out a purpose?" This book is definitely filled with ableist language, but it also breaks some myths about what would be appropriate jobs for young women. One passage reads, quote, "Teaching? You do not know anything well enough to teach it. Sewing? That means slow starvation. Business? No capital to begin with. The situation does look discouraging. Never mind. Try again." I just found it a little patronizing. She also points out that a job doesn't belong to you, that you will have to continue to work hard to keep it once you have it. But she adds the positive note that everyone has something they're good at, and they can start there and build on it and gain respect. Over time, she'd shifted away from preaching the importance of being a good wife and mother to promoting the idea that women could be entirely focused on their careers and contribute to society in that way.
In the late 1890s, Crowley started writing a more comprehensive history of women's clubs in the U.S., titled The History of the Women's Club Movement in America. The book's dedication, which was a reproduction of the words as written in June's own hand, read, quote, "This book has been a labor of love, and it is lovingly dedicated to the 20th century woman by one who has seen and shared in the struggles, hopes, and aspirations of the woman in the 19th century." That book was released in 1898. And in it, she gave particular focus to cirrhosis, of course, but also New England Women's Club, which is often invoked as a contender with cirrhosis for first women's club in the U.S., Friends in Council of Quincy, Illinois, the Fortnightly Club of Chicago, the Civic Club of Philadelphia, and Working Girls Clubs. Of the Working Girls Clubs, she wrote, quote, "This convention was a revelation to a public that had only known working girls through the whining and crying of sentimental sympathizers who had nothing in common with working girls themselves."
In 1898, the year her history of women's clubs was published, Jane, who was 69, fell and broke her hip. Recovery took a long time, and she consulted doctors throughout the United States Northeast and in Europe to try to regain some of her health like it was from before the fall. But this did not really seem to work, although there's not much information about the specifics. In October of 1900, she wrote a resignation letter to the New York Women's Press Club. It read in part, quote, "It was really a grief to me not to be able to meet you individually and collectively before leaving to be absent the entire season. The accident which disabled me for the summer threatens to cripple me for the winter also. And in this condition of dependence and general disability, it seemed best to go where I could have seclusion and the care of some member of my own family. I resign my place among you with less reluctance because the Women's Press Club is now strong and well able to guard its own interests and direct its own affairs. Remember that a well-rounded club is an epitome of the world, that it never can and never ought to be perfect according to any one individual's idea of perfection, for everyone's ideal is different, and it is the unity in this diversity which constitutes the spiritual life of the club, as the soul animates and inspires the body. Exalt the club, bring your best to the front, extinguish personal aims. Mind not all the little picking and carping of human gadflies, whose desire to extract blood is perhaps a survival of their species and an evidence of their unfitness for human companionship."
Jane died on September 23rd, 1901. She may have had a stroke just before her death. That's a detail that appears only in a couple of accounts, but it's not clear where they got that information and if one account was just parroting what another had said. She was buried next to her husband David in Lakewood, New Jersey.
2 weeks after Jane's death, the Cirrhosis Club and the Woman's Press Club met at the Waldorf Astoria to remember Jane and her contributions to the women's movement. The meeting was also open to the public, and many women's groups from the New York area prepared letters to be read at the meeting.
The then president of Cirrhosis, Dimmies Dennison, read a letter that included the following passage about Jane. Quote, "Mrs. Croly had that particular sense of fellowship among women most unusual. If you will stop to think, in our language you will find that there are no words to express that thought except those that are masculine. Fellowship, brotherhood, fraternity. Mrs. Croly, perhaps more than any other woman in the world, had the sense of what fellowship or fraternity meant in women. And although she sometimes may have been called an idealist or sentimentalist, it is recognized by many women that this thought must be abiding. For in a federation, it is the spirit that is current through it that keeps the federation alive."
Cirrhosis printed a memorial book of her letters and writings, which included a biography written by her brother. He wrote this of his sister, quote, "The most interesting and potent fact within the range of human knowledge is personality. And in the person of Jane Cunningham Croly, Jennie June, a potency was apparent, which has affected the social life of more women, perhaps, than any other single controlling factor of the same period."
One of the really interesting passages from that biography kind of seeks to identify the source of Jane's influential personality. So John wrote, quote, "What was the secret of Jennie June's charm and power? Not scholarship, let this be said in all sincerity. How greatly she appreciated the scholar's advantages was well known to her intimate friends, but these advantages did not belong to her." He also noted that it wasn't wealth or social rank, because though she made a good living, she was not an aristocrat by any means. He continued, quote, "Nor did Jennie June pattern her work according to the advice or after the example of any one man or woman. There was no example by which she could be guided. Woman was a new factor in journalism, and Jennie June was a new woman, a new creation. I cannot too fully emphasize the fact that she was a new and original personality in journalism. She was unalterably true to her divine womanly ideals of woman's nature, place in society, and redemptive work. I say redemptive work, for it was one of her deepest convictions that woman's function was to be the saving salt of all life. Jennie June's recognition of this vital truth brought her into sympathy with a worldwide movement. The new woman is no monstrosity, no sporadic creature born of intellectual fermentation and unrest, but the rise and development of a better, nobler type of womanhood the world over. Jennie June's eminent distinction was that she was a leader in this movement.
When Jane died, there were still cirrhosis chapters all over the country. A lot of them were shuttered by the mid 1950s, but some have hung on into the 21st century. A lot of them were absorbed into other groups, or their members moved on to other clubs when their cirrhosis chapter closed.
The General Federation of Women's Clubs, though, is still going strong. Today, its mission is stated as, quote, "The General Federation of Women's Clubs is an international women's organization dedicated to community improvement by enhancing the lives of others through volunteer service." And that is Jane Cunningham Croly, aka Jennie June.
Do you also have some listener mail?
I do, and this one delights me because it's one of those things that I have actually meant to mention on the show a number of times, or thought maybe I should, and then I didn't. This is from our listener, Chandra, who writes, "Hi, Holly and Tracy. This is mostly for Holly after the sewing-related episode. A friend texted me to ask if I sew, and I initially replied, 'No, I am not a sewer.' And then I realized that's not what I mean, because of course it's spelled like sewer. But that got me thinking what the current term is for a person who sews. Seamstress seems outdated and too gendered. Tailor doesn't seem quite right. My husband suggested seamstrix. A friend said stitch wizard. But I'd really like to know, Holly, how do you refer to yourself in terms of being a person who sews? As pet tax, I've attached a picture of our 3 cats and one of our guinea pig. Although there are 2 white cats, the middle cat is unrelated, and the white cat close to the camera and the tortie are brother and sister. They're in our walled-in yard where they're safe but can enjoy the outdoors and chase mice as they are in the picture. We have a guinea pig too, despite being a middle-aged couple with no kids, because piggies are adorable and they're a much more fun way to dispose of vegetable scraps than a boring old compost pile. She hangs out in my office with me while I work from home. Love the show, and I'm looking forward to October and the Halloween-related episodes that come up then. These cats are so cute. And listen, guinea pigs are adorable. I believe you. As for the sewing thing, you instantly brought me back to the 2nd grade without probably meaning to, Chandra, because my 2nd grade teacher, Miss Hollis, who was a wonder of a human being, and I loved her desperately, was the first person who really opened my eyes to the fact that you cannot call someone a sewer because it's spelled like sewer, and nobody wants that. At the time, that being the 70s, seamstress was pretty frequently used. Today, I like either sewist or stitcher. Those are the ones I tend to use. They seem the least gendered and least loaded, and also the most accurate, frankly, because sometimes, you're right, it's not the same as being a tailor because they really specialize in specific kinds of garments. Those are the ones that I like. I also like Stitch Witch, but that's just me for fun. Uh, I'm sure there's another one that isn't appropriate for our show, but it rhymes with Stitch Witch. You can put it together from there. I love that you brought this up because it really was such a fun memory of being in my second grade classroom and learning that you really shouldn't say someone is a sewer. If you would like to write to us, you can do that at historypodcast@iheartradio.com. You can also subscribe to the show if you have not done that already, just about anywhere you listen to your favorite shows.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.